Let's take a closer look at the female reproductive system. Remember that in the female reproductive system, the primary sex organs are the ovaries, the organs that actually produce the ova. The rest of the organs are involved in the transport, the nourishment, and the protection of the developing offspring, like the uterine tube that carries the fertilized egg to the uterus where the pre-embryo implants and grows into an embryo and a fetus and is eventually pushed out by the labor contractions through the vagina, and then the breasts that provide the nourishment to the developing baby. The ovaries are held to the uterus by the ovarian ligament, and then they're connected to the other body systems like the blood supply and the lymphatic system and the nervous system through the suspensory ligament, which isn't shown. The ovaries are interesting, like the testes, because they're both endocrine and exocrine organs. The endocrine function of the ovaries is to release hormones into the bloodstream. The ovaries release estrogen and progesterone, which we'll be talking more about later. The exocrine secretion of the ovaries are the actual eggs, or ova. What makes ovaries unusual as exocrine organs is that there's no duct to carry the ova out of the ovary. Since there is no duct, how do the eggs get out of the ovaries? The secret is in the follicle. Around each mature ovum, there develops a follicle. This follicle fills with fluid until eventually it bursts, almost like popping a blister. And when it bursts, the ovum is released. The released ovum is actually loose there for a moment, outside the ovary, but not in any other organ. It's the fimbriae and the infundibulum of the uterine tube that are really important at this stage. The fimbriae sort of cradle the ovary so that when the ovum is released, it's right there where the fimbriae can help collect it. The cilia all along the fimbriae beat and create little currents in the fluid in the pelvic cavity that help to sweep the released ovum into the infundibulum where it can go into the uterine tube instead of floating off into the pelvic cavity. The ova are produced by a process called oogenesis or oogenesis. This is the process that actually produces the mature eggs through the process of meiosis. We saw the process of meiosis before when we were looking at the production of sperm. The process in oogenesis is a bit different. Unlike spermatogenesis that produces 400 million sperm per day and is happening all the time, oogenesis only produces one mature gamete per month. And it takes years to produce that mature gamete. As a matter of fact, to get from the beginning to the end of meiosis for oogenesis, we begin before birth. And the second division of meiosis isn't actually complete until fertilization. Let's take a closer look at this process. Before a baby girl is even born, the cells in her ovaries begin dividing. The cells in the ovaries divide by the process of mitosis to make a whole lot of cells called oogonia. We produce about 6 to 7 million oogonia in those tiny little ovaries inside a baby girl who isn't even born yet. These oogonia become primary oocytes, the cells that will eventually divide by meiosis to produce the mature ova. Now, not all of these oogonia survive. In fact, a lot of them die even before a baby girl is born. Even though she starts with 6 to 7 million oogonia, a baby girl will only have about 2 million primary oocytes when she's born. These are going to continue to die off during childhood so that by the onset of puberty, a girl has only about 400,000 primary oocytes remaining. Of these 400,000 oocytes, less than 500 will actually produce mature ova. Think about it for just a moment. If a girl is going to ovulate once every 28 days from age 14 to age 50, that's only a total of 480 ovulations, assuming that none are missed due to pregnancy or other reasons. So before birth, we have a couple million of these primary oocytes, and they all begin the process of meiosis. They begin getting ready to divide. They copy their DNA, the chromosomes condense, and then it stalls out. Before we even get to the first division of meiosis, the process stalls out. And it just sort of stops there. And it stays that way for years. So the process begins before birth and stalls out, and then the cells just stay there, just sort of in suspended animation, until after puberty. With the onset of puberty, the ovaries begin the process of being ready for ovulation. What happens is several months before any particular cycle, several months before an ovulation, a group of 5 to 15 primary oocytes begin developing follicles. During follicle development, layers of granulosa cells form around the primary oocytes. These granulosa cells are secretory cells that release estrogen. The oocyte also forms a protective wall called a zona pellucida, a protein layer around the outside of the oocyte, but before we get to the granulosa cells. This is going to provide protection. 5 to 15 oocytes begin this process of months of building follicles, but we know that women typically only ovulate one ovum at a time. So what happens is, as they're all developing their follicles and these follicles are getting bigger, eventually one follicle emerges as the dominant follicle, sort of the biggest, strongest, best follicle. And that one will remain, and the rest of them are all going to die off. So about a week before ovulation, we're down to just one dominant follicle. In this follicle, we begin forming an antrum, which is a fluid-filled space. So fluid will start to seep into the layers of the granulosa cells and collect into a cavity that gets bigger and bigger as it fills with more and more fluid. Shortly before ovulation, this follicle is just about ready to pop when we finally complete the first division of meiosis. All this time, we started the first division of meiosis before birth. Finally, right before ovulation, we can complete the first division of meiosis. Something interesting about the way meiosis occurs in oocytes is it's not an even division into two even cells. That's what we saw with spermatogenesis. The primary spermatocyte divided into two secondary spermatocytes that were about even. That's not the way it works with oogenesis. In oogenesis, our one ovum divides, but it divides unevenly. Half of the chromosomes and all of the good stuff, the membrane, the organelles, the cytoplasm, the nutrients, all of that goes into one cell. The other half of the chromosomes and a tiny bit of membrane gets packaged up together in another sort of cell called a polar body. That polar body is not viable. It's not a real cell. It's not going to grow and divide. It basically dies. What's important about this is if you think about what sperm are lean, mean swimming machines. Tiny little things that swim really fast and need to be really light. The egg, on the other hand, is what provides all of the organelles and the nutrients to the zygote, to the developing offspring. The bigger and stronger the egg is, the better the chance the offspring will survive. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to take one egg and divide it into two even smaller, weaker eggs. What we do is an uneven division that puts all the good stuff in one oocyte. We now call this the secondary oocyte, and a little polar body that we don't worry about. Once this first division of meiosis is complete, we reach ovulation. At this point, the follicle bursts open and the oocyte is released, where it's collected by the fimbriae into the infundibulum of the uterine tube, and it begins making its way toward the uterus. The remains of the follicle are still in the ovary. There are still pieces of follicle that are left in the ovary. Those remains of the follicle become a structure called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is very important because it produces the hormone progesterone. Progesterone is a necessary hormone for maintaining a pregnancy. So the remains of the follicle must form a corpus luteum to make progesterone if we're going to maintain a pregnancy if the ovum that was just released manages to get fertilized. If the ovum is not fertilized, it dies in about 24 hours without ever having completed the process of meiosis. If that oocyte, that secondary oocyte that's now in the uterine tube, if that oocyte is fertilized by a sperm, then right when the sperm penetrates into the oocyte, that's when the second division of meiosis occurs. That second division of meiosis will produce a second polar body. So it's another uneven division. One cell gets all the good stuff, and then we take those extra chromosomes and put them into the little polar body. What's left with that good big cell has half of the chromosomes from the oocyte, and it has the chromosomes from the sperm. When those join together, we get our 2N zygote. That zygote begins dividing by the process of mitosis as it's moved along through the uterine tube toward the uterus.